Ketan Patel is the founder of Force for Good, and John Miller is its director. Ketan, why did you launch Force for Good?
It wasn't something I'd planned to launch, but it was something the United Nations invited me to an event, and this emerged from it ultimately. So the event was to look at capital, the capital flows of the world, capitalism itself as a system, and to figure out whether that system and the money would support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a wonderful experience working with some very smart, very kind, compassionate people to look at whether it was possible to achieve the SDGs. This was in 2019.
And may I ask, why did they choose you for that?
So it's a good question. They chose many people, and I was one of them. And it just so happened that I had a career in finance before, working for Goldman Sachs, based in New York, and had some appreciation at least of the flow of capital on the macro stage of the world, and the markets and how it moves through those markets and reaches its destinations and that decision-making process. But also I ran an investment firm, and we invest for impact and for profit for clients all over the world, and we do it in emerging markets. So there were two good reasons for me to be in that room.
So Force for Good got started,
Yeah.
and you started trying to do what the mission was, to investigate how the financial community could serve the goals of the sustainability goals.
Jurriaan, that's right. Yeah.
And so what did you do next?
So the initial job was to figure out what is happening to the money, where is it, and where is it ending up, and how much of it will potentially fund the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That in itself is a huge task, because money is, of course, dispersed all over the planet. There's a concentration in America. It's managed through financial institutions who manage 70 to 85% actually of the world's money. Doesn't matter who has it originally, it ends up through these institutions. So that's quite a big task. We managed to engage at least the data of 60-something of the largest institutions in the world. And 30 of those were active with us, having a qualitative dialogue about why they allocate capital and what they do it for, and what their objectives are.
And part of what Ketan is saying that's interesting is that information didn't exist before, which shows you that, for example, the UN was not knowledgeable about the financial markets and where money was being spent even for the goals that they had articulated, the SDGs. So as a first step, it was really very important just to understand what money was going where, what was the baseline to start from these kinds of institutions, and then to marry that together with some of the initiatives that the UN was interested in.
So what did you conclude? I mean, to what extent is the money going in, if I can say, the right direction?
So I mean, here's what we found. The Sustainable Development Goals was set up in 2015. In 2015, you didn't have, as John said, the sophisticated data to understand the flow of money. Once we had over time, of course, people started to gather this data, and people signed up to programs like PRI, which collects this data from financial institutions. But the ability to look across it all, to see all the patterns, to see the destinations, to see the strategies, that takes a deep qualitative understanding too.
Of course.
And here's what we found. There's a huge amount of money. I mean, like today, in today's terms, we're nearly at $500 billion worth of liquid financial assets in the world. And if you just then said, well, how much is the GDP? It's sufficient to fund whatever we want to fund.
Mm-hmm.
But this money is keeping the lights on, if you like, for the world as it is today.
Yes.
For those people that have light.
Yeah.
It isn't designed to flow to people who don't have light to turn their lights on.
Uh-huh.
The money's in your pension, your insurance policy,
Yes.
your savings account, your school fees account for your children.
Yes.
And you don't authorize it to be used
to turn the lights on somewhere else.
Somewhere else in some country that you don't know or understand that might have a different risk. You want that money to be safe. And the financial institutions and all the regulations around them are designed to make sure that they do exactly that for you, because you're the customer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they have a lot of discretion with capital too to allocate. And but that is marginal relative to the volume of money. So what we found was somewhere between $2 and $4 trillion every year gets allocated to what you might call doing good in the world in terms of, if you measured it against the Sustainable Development Goals.
Out of the 500.
Nearly $500 trillion.
So it's less than 1%.
It's insignificant.
And just as importantly, it's much less than what's needed. So one of the other pieces of analysis that we did was what is actually needed to turn the tide on the SDGs, and of course climate it being one of the single largest need. And I'll let Ketan say, but it's a pretty significant figure.
You'd need something like $14 trillion a year.
14.
14.
Yeah.
And you would start to make a huge impact. But if you do that every year, it adds up. And over a 10-year period or so, you would have funded lots of the world's biggest issues, and you would have solved them, right?
But would it be fair? I mean, I understand, of course, your point is well taken, that money is there to serve, at least. I mean, it's set up for people to live a comfortable life when they no longer work. I understand how it happened.
Yes.
But if we were to say, maybe even by government regulation, okay, 10% of that needs to be put at risk.
Yes.
Would that help?
I would say it would help enormously.
Yeah.
But today, most governments around the world seem to be in the richest countries, which includes the countries where you might have been born and your children might have been born, and this country too.
Yes.
Have an issue where they have an underclass developing now of people who are truly poor.
Mm-hmm.
There is systemic poverty in the richest of countries. There are people who face social exclusion, and somehow their own systems within rich countries are not working to fund their own poor, to keep them employed, to keep them with the lights on, to keep them educated and in food and worthwhile employment. And they are, as a result, voting for people who say, we will deliver that, but not the other thing.
I see that, but that brings me to, and we can always take this out of this conversation.
No, keep it in.
But I'm going to ask you, so...
Our job is to find answers, right? So I want you to ask me about that.
So, what we see, I mean, we have never mastered throughout history, we have never been able to prevent that the civilization evolves to the point that the money ends up in a few hands. That has always been the case, and that's the end of civilization.
Yes.
If that's the trajectory, you have nothing to do. It's just waiting for the end.
I love it. So here's what we concluded. The money is there. The money is designed to do what it does, and one of the things it's designed to do is make a return for the risk that it takes. So if it is profitable to serve the poor and to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, money will flow. And so in the last year and a half, what we have done is focus our attention on two sectors in particular. One is technology, and the other is the finance sector, to say, can technology enable this change to happen at great scale?
Yeah.
And John's a specialist in some of this field as a media and technology person, but I would say that what we found was we grouped them into 9 big areas, but there are 9 big solution sets which are already at great scale and proven, which if you chose to roll out at an even bigger scale across the world, it would solve, we think now, based on our calculations, which are tediously difficult to do, but solve 90% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to that, it is profitable to do so, and the opportunity we valued at something like $15 trillion. So there is a profit to be made from doing this.
Yeah.
There's one though rub, one difficult point, which is if you're a country that needs these solutions, unless you're prepared to create an environment where when money comes in, it gets to operate to international rules of some sort, make its profit, and take it home, then that money will not come. So investors perceive a risk in certain countries because the government policies, rules, regulations, business environment does not suit them, they feel, to come in and make money. But what is clear is, in today's environment, there is no choice but to change those environments so that they are conducive to this money flowing in, because otherwise it won't come. And we will have a multi-tiered world where people who are poor will not be helped to get out of that poverty.
And Ketan said a lot of important things there. One was the idea that the solutions, most needed solutions already exist.
Yes.
We don't have to invent them, we need to deploy them. And it relates to a line, I don't know if you're familiar with the science fiction writer William Gibson, who said, the future has already arrived, it's just not evenly distributed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very true, and we've kind of outlined that with the technologies we focused on. And so it's very important that that people understand these are proven things that they can back. But then there's the societal and governmental conditions that actually allow for the deployment of capital. So we spend a lot of current time on that, which is how can we create those conditions where the capital can be deployed.
Yes. Yeah, I have to say that I was sitting in this very seat talking to Jim Chu of Untapped Global. Have you talked to him? Because that is the guy who's doing this at small scale, really using the infrastructure that is there with little money, I would say, to get entrepreneurship going.
So Jurriaan, I'm going to go a step further. So the UN recognizes this challenge, of course.
Yes.
They've been asking for 7 or 8 years now and getting louder and louder at saying, the money's there, can you please deploy it to the countries that need it? And they face this dilemma where the money doesn't flow at the volume they wish. What is clear, though, is if the solution goes to the countries, the money will follow. And if the solution is a solution that is profitable, then huge amounts of capital can follow that. So what the UN is doing with us is collaborating with us, where we're bringing those that have the solution, and they're bringing the people that want those solutions together to have this discussion, to see if we can arrive at the conclusion, that the transaction ultimately, where this solution will flow and the capital will follow. And we've begun that, and we're very excited because it is possible to do this. And I think what is quite encouraging is that there is a willingness on all sides to see the world get better and these solutions to flow. So we're very hopeful, actually, that this is possible.
That's good to hear. What is the, I mean, if you're in the middle of two parties, the UN, say, on the one side, and the investment community on the other side, I'm sure that the investment community, at least, in verbal conversation, will support all these goals because they also think that's important. But then, when it comes to reality, it seems hard for them to make these decisions in the right way, as you have explained. But to what extent does Force for Good help that process?
So our job is to help that, is to identify the solution owner.
So you bring the solution to these people?
Absolutely. And then we facilitate that dialogue.
But wouldn't it be that the investment fund has a research department that also figures these
They do.
solutions
I mean, these are
out?
very smart global institutions that
I'm
invest.
Sure. Yes.
But here's the difference. We're not going to necessarily, the financial institution saying, will you please just invest and figure it out? Mm-hmm. We're going to somebody who has a solution. So for example, and it's not always the private sector. Private sector has a lot of solutions. Mm-hmm. Governments have solutions. Small entrepreneurs sometimes have solutions. But we want them scaled, remember, because we want them scaled to prove that they can be scaled even further. And so let's say we found a solution. I'll give an example that we found which is fascinating. So the Indian government had a solution for financial inclusion. You spent time in India. You know how complicated the country is and how big it is, and how many people there are to include who don't have bank accounts.
Yes.
So 10 years ago or so, they introduced a technology that opened bank accounts for people based on their ID. Something like nearly 500 million bank accounts have been opened. These bank accounts have the social security check in there, but they have a savings account, and they have a credit card attached to it, and they have an insurance policy, and they have health insurance because they think that's a human right. Mm-hmm. Now it turns out that this technology, the Indian government, we entered this dialogue with them to say, did they think they could donate it to the rest of the world?
Yes.
And they have done so. And the UN were great. They hosted an event, and the Indian government offered this technology, and Force for Good was invited to join that group and the panel, and a whole bunch of countries have now signed up to say they would like this. Now the basis of prosperity is at least one of the key things is you have a bank account to even participate in the system. So that's a good example. There's a solution. There's a bunch of countries that need it. Our job is to see if we can encourage A to work with B. In this case, they were already delighted to do it.
Would it be right to say that you start with the solution and then start seeing how
Start with the solution. If you start asking for money, the answer is no.
Okay.
Well, I would say we actually start with bounding the conditions, right, and understanding what's needed, and then you can determine what solutions make the most sense to try to get involved with. and
so
help.
first you do the thinking, and then you
Yeah.
get to the concrete solution, then you get to the concrete dialogue.
Yeah.
Is there a top 3 of solutions?
But there are. I think financial inclusion is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a critical one.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
participation.
Yeah.
Participation.
There is a second one which is interesting, which is that, you know, in the world we have solved many things to do with healthcare. And most of the rich countries in the world are beneficiaries of all the breakthroughs we've made. But we know that medicine doesn't flow through somehow to the poorest of countries.
Yes.
And so another solution, of course, is figuring out how do you remove the barriers to the flow of medicines, and similarly to the flow of food,
Okay.
and similarly to the flow of other basic essentials. So that is a solution set. One at a different extreme is climate and the climate changes that we have to make to cope with climate change itself. And for that, what we found is most countries don't possess a policy set that would encourage people who would go and set up renewable facilities in a country to come and do that. And so having a climate policy is a solution, a policy that is conducive to people, the industry setting up in your country. And so here we look for policymakers, people who write policy, who form it for a country so it can put it through its parliament. And so we're being inventive. We're looking everywhere to find these answers. And I'm shocked how many great answers there are out there. There really are.
This is really true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I once wrote on my screen a line that really, sometimes you have these things that come to you, right? I said, there are just not enough problems for the solutions that we have. And I really felt that at that moment. So maybe you see some of that. But my question is, if there would be one thing you could wish for, or one thing you could rule the world for a minute, and you would implement this rule because that would really help, what would that be?
You know, I think the one simplest thing I wish I could see happen was that we adopted a set of rules and agreements or policies that mean that every environment in the world is willing to accept that their country can be conducive to the flow of capital. And so we reduce the risk of capital flowing. It's the difference in risk that often accounts for why money doesn't flow. So if we could work together to do that, now you could never eliminate that because a lot of that might be related to the country's people and their skill sets and their education levels and the climate of the country and the environment, the crops, and there's so many factors. But there is a lot that policy can do to affect that, and I wish we could do that.
We had a conversation around last year's UN General Assembly where a major corporation literally said they would invest multiple tens of billions of dollars in Africa for certain things if, as Ketan just said, there could be a climate where they could feel comfortable putting the money in. It's not a question that the money wouldn't go there. It would go there if you can provide the conditions under which they can feel safe doing it.
Yeah. I want to say something else, though, which is quite important, which is we should not blame the victims of circumstance, of weather, of so many environmental conditions, and sometimes bad government too, but so many things out of their control for their problems. But now here we sit today at the height of our civilization across the world. Maybe we peaked and dropped a bit, right? But we have solved so many issues. Our science has taken us so many places. It's untenable that we could not apply that to solve every problem on the planet.
It's true. But I feel there's also a bit of a chicken and egg in what you're saying. I mean, I understand that these investors feel uncertain about making the investment in that society because that society is unstable to some extent. So we get that. But we also know that South Korea was able to go from A to B or Z in 20 years and somehow did it, and Japan before, and there are a few others.
Yes.
So what can we learn from that?
So there are, we in our study of the differences between countries, what we found is that there's a critical set almost of success factors. And it's odd what they are, but some of them are to do with systems of rule of law and order. Mm-hmm. Some of them are to do with a depth of education in the country. Some of them are a visionary leader who, despite whatever happened before, can see a different way and is determined to get it done. And we identified nearly a dozen of those factors. And what you find is it's difficult to engineer those. Some of these you can engineer, policies or whatever, but even those are difficult. Because if you're a democracy, you have to get it through a democracy. And what we sometimes found was, when a country wasn't democracy, they found it easier to implement certain changes, right? So these factors are very difficult to actually make happen in a country. It's clear what they should be, though. There's enough research to do that.
You made quite some progress. Where is Force for Good in 10 years from now?
In 10 years from now, I hope that we've solved at least 90% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we've set a higher bar. And if the UN Sustainable Development Goals were about sustainability, I think our next challenge is sustainability. Certainly it will remain, but security and creating a far superior platform for the world. And so we have been transitioning our thinking to sustainable, secure and superior future for all of humanity.
No lack of ambition.
No, we shouldn't do that. We should be ambitious.
Good for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ketan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.